physics, and eventually went as far as a dissertation in dark matter direct detection. Decided to go back into defense-related work, this time as a researcher. And now I currently serve at the MITRE Corporation, doing R&D and overseeing the technical quality of some of the work that we do. Today's topic is Russia, specifically AI, autonomy, and space warfare. We heard, if you were in the talk yesterday, one of the earlier talks yesterday, we heard about poking the Russian bear, which is a great phrase. We do have peers and near peers. The US's position as the preeminent and dominant force in space is no longer the case. That's a landscape that's been changing over time, and there's always been competition in space, but the competition's really heating up, and it's in more fronts than just space. It's how space actually connects to ground and connects to the services and the things that the warfighter actually depends on. There's a great analogy in that talk about, it began with the fact that Putin is a black belt in judo, and judo focuses on using your enemy's momentum against them, or perhaps using what they think is a strength as an actual potential weakness that you can exploit. It's a good and a true analogy for a lot of the things that are occurring today and have occurred historically. Recently we've all seen in the news things like the pipeline hack, SolarWinds. That's all cybersecurity related, but how does it affect other parts of the landscape, especially the combat landscape or national security landscape? You could even go all the way back to something like the Rosat hack in 1998, where a NASA-owned controlled satellite may or may not have been hacked such that it faced the sun for too long and burnt out its solar panels. Just like the pipeline hack, the SolarWinds hack, things like that, there is no public knowledge or smoking gun evidence as to who was really behind that, what really happened. But in general, a lot of people look to and point to Russian capabilities being behind a lot of these recent events, even some events that occurred decades ago. So the question is, if there is a significant capability in that dimension, what happens when you add things like autonomy and artificial intelligence to the mix? And when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're not talking about Terminator robots that think, that are sentient or anything like that. What we're talking about is algorithms that can do things that humans do well, that computers traditionally do not do well. Which are things like categorization, or identifying something like a particular modulation scheme in the RF spectrum, or identifying a decoy from a real object, whether those are flying objects or potential attack vectors in the cybersecurity landscape. Autonomy is when you have a system that can make decisions on its own. It's been given the authority to act. So it doesn't just provide data, it may end up removing a human in the loop where there traditionally might have been a human. So if you take all these things combined, you may end up with a highly capable system or country that could potentially cripple an otherwise seemingly more powerful peer, near peer, or adversary. So that's what we're going to talk about in the light of Russia capabilities, Russian ambitions. And so with me today, we have two authors and recent Air University students, Captain Lee from the Squadron Officer School. Her paper, and by the way, both of these papers should be linked in the website for the link for this talk. But Captain Lee's paper focuses on Russia moving into something called new generation warfare. And I'm going to let her talk a little bit about what that means. And then we have Miss Dominguez, who's a student at Air Command and Staff College. Her paper focuses on Russia's plans and ambitions with AI and autonomy and how that can be a key differentiator in future potential conflict. So if you haven't seen or read these papers, I strongly encourage you to go ahead and download them. These are really comprehensive papers in both topic areas that are delivered in a not overly long format. It's only a few pages, but you really get a good sense for what the capabilities are that Russia has, what their ambitions are, and how that might affect the US and the free world in the future. And then, of course, there's some suggestions about what we should actually do about this. These are really difficult topics to address at the unclass levels. So the fact that we have really comprehensive quality overviews and research related to both topics at the unclass level is to me a privilege and a delight. So I would encourage everybody download this, read it, and then share it with other people who are interested in the topic. So with that said, what I want to do is I want to give Captain Lee an opportunity to tell us a little bit more about new generation warfare. What does that mean in terms of Russian capabilities, and why is Russia taking this tack? Why are they focusing on what you call new generation warfare?
Hello, so thanks for the lovely introduction. And I just want to say I am by no means an expert, but I am glad I had the opportunity to research this particular topic. So when it comes to new generation warfare, what Russia means by that is it refers to a hybrid means of waging war via like non-traditional, non-military, non-conventional means. So things that we consider traditional instruments of power, like actual kidding warfare. That's not what new generation warfare is. New generation warfare is about information warfare, political subversion, like cyber ops, just using everything across like the diplomatic, economic, military, spectrum in order to wage war. And so, in examining this topic, I look specifically at how Russia is using that in space. And when it comes to like space and Russia's counter space capabilities, traditionally counter space capabilities, you can separate that into like 4 different types: kinetic physical capabilities, non-kinetic physical capabilities, electronic, and cyber. And kinetic physical capabilities would be like what you imagine as like maybe a ballistic missile designed to take out a satellite. Non-kinetic physical capabilities are, directed energy weapons. Sorry, I blinked for a second there, but laser applications, things that affect a satellite system or space systems like physical hardware, but it does not use a kinetic means of delivery. And then, of course, there's electronics such as jamming, downlink jamming, and then cyber when, for example, like the Rosat hack, of course, even though there isn't, hard evidence out there pinning it down to the Russians, that speculation, those kinds of cyber attacks are what I think will be Russia's approach to the space domain in implementing next generation warfare. So the reason, sorry, were you going to say something?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So, and why is this important? Because Russia's advancements in next generation warfare, especially when it comes to the application of cyber, like hacking, compromising other states' systems in counterspace, that has significant implications for the United States. Because we are extremely dependent on our space architecture. We have like the largest space architecture in the world. We have so many satellites. We depend on them for our missile systems, our defense systems, navigation, ISR, and all of that. But especially given that we have a lot of legacy systems, and we don't have a governing body with standards for the cybersecurity of space systems. We our space architecture is, I think, vulnerable. There are gaps in coverage. And if those vulnerabilities are left unaddressed, and Russia, as it gains more and more proficiency in, implementing this next new generation warfare, especially through cyber, they can exploit those vulnerabilities and gain an asymmetrical advantage. And, that's a big deal for us, because as soon as they have that advantage, if they're able to put us offline or things like that, that puts us at risk of losing the next war, probably before it's even begun. So what can we do about this this issue? Well, I think there are two things. One, we need to examine the cybersecurity of our systems individually and as a whole, and if possible, reinforce them. So in 2014, NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory conducted a simulated cyber attack on a close approximation of a real-world mission architecture. And what they found was that while each unique system was secure, the combination of systems presented vulnerabilities. And so with that kind of experiment in mind, I think it'd be good for us, as for the United States and our allies, to examine our existing space architecture, determine whether there are gaps in our aggregated systems, and then for those systems that we build moving forward, to make sure we are accounting for the potential vulnerabilities that come when you're consolidating a set of systems without accounting for that space in between. And then the second thing that I think we need is to work towards mandatory cybersecurity standards. And mandatory standards, I think, will provide many benefits, particularly in spaces like the supply chain. So, the supply chain is just as vulnerable to attack as the actual software or the firmware, because that's where a bad actor could get into the software or the firmware. If there is an unreliable vendor or someone who's been compromised, and they can add a backdoor somewhere so that they can access our systems later. That standards will ensure better vetting and more thorough vetting, and hopefully result in higher quality products. And one place to start would be to adopt existing frameworks and guidance out there, such as the National Institute of Standards for Technology framework. So that is a quick overview of my paper.
Okay, so one of the things that you mentioned was the combination of systems. It was the combination of systems that created additional vulnerability, even though the individual systems were technically secure. What were the, if what were the attack vectors that were presented by combining the systems? What was it about combining them that created the vulnerability? I'm just not clear on that. Was it the fact that it was the actual connection between the two, and then what could we do about that? Is it just as simple as identifying the communication channels or the specific links? What can we do to secure combinations of systems together?
So the JPL study, and I will say it's a relatively short paper, but what they identified was that when they consolidated the systems, the security was dependent on underlying systems triggering the alarm, basically. So it was more of well, I'm sure level A is going to trigger the alarm if something's wrong at level B. So it's like if a 5-story building had security cameras, fire alarms, and sprinklers on every floor, but none in the emergency exit stairwells. So someone could set a fire on the first floor, and the cameras, fire alarms, and sprinklers would detect who started the fire and put out the fire. But if someone started a floor on the stairwell between the second and third floor, no one would be able to see it. And so while it didn't specify the exact vulnerabilities of their mission architecture, probably just to protect their own security, but their basically what they were saying is that because individual A, B, and C is secure doesn't mean that A, B, and C together will protect each other. They just need to, pardon me. The individual layers need to protect each other from themselves, basically.
Got it. Okay, so the dependencies themselves also cause problems.
Mm-hmm.
So You also mentioned legacy systems, and it's absolutely true. We have a lot of old systems in space. You know, it has historically been the case that America invests in a program of record, and that program, the research begins, and for example, the satellite will fly somewhere along the lines of 3 to 10 years after the program begins. That is a long time for threats to emerge. And by the time the satellite actually flies, it may already be obsolete in terms of cybersecurity, especially if it is not a reprogrammable satellite. And I know we've got a lot of cool stuff going up, like NTS-3, the new GPS demonstrator, which is going to have things like reprogrammable waveforms and all sorts of stuff like that. But for the existing systems, and for systems already on the books, where the program of record does not move as fast as we'd like it to move, and again, the U.S. is making great strides in improving that speed. But for now, for the systems we have that are old or legacy systems, but we still use, and in many ways we still rely upon, what can we do about securing those systems? Or is it something that we just have to move rapidly to replace and reconstitute in the future?
Yeah, and that's a tough one because, like you said, I mean, especially when it comes to cyber ops, it's the hard thing about cyber actors, or like bad cyber actors and cyber attacks, is that they're malicious, persistent, and consistently evolving. So, I mean, it's like the flu virus. We have a new strain every year, and cyber attacks, I think, will only become more and more sophisticated. So when it comes to those legacy systems, I think, for those satellites or the hardware out there that, we can't necessarily reprogram them because of the way they were built or how long ago they were built. I think what we can focus on is probably the ground segment of that architecture, because it is easier to access than a satellite that's way out there. And to the extent that we can reinforce the cybersecurity of our ground link up, it is to a degree of some kind of preventative measure that we can take when it comes to those legacy systems. And then I think for those systems that we are building now, I think more and more of them are starting to incorporate like the field programmable software. So hopefully that will, help us with, revamping cybersecurity as our threats become more and more sophisticated or as they evolve. But yes, I think for the legacy ones, there's only so much we can do, but the ground segment is probably a good place to start.
Ms. Dominguez, any comments, questions?
Yes, I had one question. I was wondering if you think that, so we're looking into more the technical aspect of trying to reinforce cybersecurity infrastructure within the satellites and in the ground systems. But do you think there is a way to also move across the DIME spectrum, so the diplomatic, information, military, and economic spectrum, essentially more of maybe the diplomacy spectrum, or the information spectrum, to deter our adversaries and deter Russia from trying to conduct cyber attacks, and also try to bring about more international pressure on Russia to deter them from these actions in the first place?
So I guess I'll start with saying that I think, so the reason I think Russia favors new generation warfare is because, as opposed to like traditional means of, waging war, it's harder to trace back to a particular state actor. So cyber attacks, like for example, Rosette, we don't know if it actually was Russia, and that's why it's like new generation warfare gives them that plausible deniability. Hey, that wasn't us. That maybe it was a rogue actor in our state. And so I think that aspect of dealing with new generation warfare makes it harder to kind of like put that pressure on Russia to like, hey, stop hacking us, or stop doing whatever it is you're doing, because the implication is like that would be like the defense is, hey, we didn't actually do anything, you're just implying we did it, but you have no proof because you can't trace it back to us. But I do think, by revamping cybersecurity and then of course, when we do discover those, those actors, whether it's a rogue actor or not, like, if you find a bad cyber actor and prosecute that person, it sends a message, whether or not they were working under another state's control or under another state's like kind of guidance. It sends a message that we are taking that's very, very seriously, and hopefully gives bad actors pause when it comes to attempting these types of attacks on the United States or its allies.
Okay, thank you very much, Captain Lee. Let's pivot now to the next topic and the next paper here from Ms. Dominguez. We have discussed a bit about cyber warfare capabilities, about new generation warfare, but let's pivot to AI and autonomy. That, as we said earlier, seems to present an equally great threat, maybe more so. It's hard to weigh one against the other, but certainly the combination of things is daunting in some regards. What are, this question for Ms. Dominguez, what are Russia's current capabilities in AI and autonomy, and what are their ambitions? Where do you see them going?
So for Russia, they're in their initial stages of developing their AI and autonomous technologies, or these emerging technologies within their military systems and in their military force. So right now they're have an array of research and development for AI and autonomy as it pertains to military systems. They recently deployed the Uran-9, the unmanned ground vehicle, which they claim has autonomous functions in Syria. So that was around 2018. And without actually having to, it was a risky move because they didn't really do all the tests on it yet. And from the publicly available information that we have, it doesn't seem like it performed that well. So they're still trying to figure out their autonomous functions and AI within their systems. And then I would also like to note that a lot of their claimed autonomous systems or claimed AI systems still have that human in the loop and still are remote controlled by human operators. So they have a long way to go, but they do have the aspirations. They recently came out with their artificial intelligence strategy as their draft artificial intelligence strategy in 2019. Just looking into more of how they want to build their infrastructure. So right now they're looking to build the intellectual and the physical infrastructure in order to start that foundational expertise in AI from a broad standpoint within the nation, and then trying to pivot that into military R&D. So what is one thing that Russia has going for it is that it brings in a lot of it meshes with the military and the private sector of trying to get that AI research and AI development directly into military systems and military acquisitions. And I think that's one problem that the US has right now, is that our acquisition reform is very bureaucratic and very slow. And Russia, at least in that sense, has been able to make sure to have a priority for military when it comes to AI and autonomy development. So there's other systems that they have out there. If we're looking at space in particular, which is what the paper mostly talks about, they do have, or they claim to have, some sort of machine learning technology in order to analyze space-based imagery. And they also have plans to look into space collision or space debris reconnaissance of some sort, and using artificial intelligence in that sense to try to predict where these predict and classify and group the debris and any collision efforts that may happen in the future, as well as looking into maybe even UAVs, high altitude UAVs that might have an ASAT capability. They have maybe not plans, but they're thinking about these things and trying to have high altitude and unmanned vehicles have some kind of ASAT capability with high tech or emerging technologies such as AI and autonomy within that system. So those are just the initial stages of Russian AI. My motivation for writing this paper was really more so to see how Russia is trying to enhance their developments and enhance their capabilities within space. They see space as very crucial and significant to not only military communications, but Russian national defense and Russian national security. So what are they trying to do, and what other emerging technologies are they trying to use to enable and increase their ability within space, and also try to threaten the US? As Captain Lee talked about, the US is perceived to have a lot of reliance on space. So they're trying to get ahead of that and make sure that they give that information advantage and overall that strategic advantage in order to really have a say in the game and leverage in the game, and do what they need to do to win that great power competition.
Okay, so there's a lot that can be done in terms of military R&D. You know, we can develop better munitions, better jets, better trained war fighters, you know, better ground architecture. There's a whole lot of things that, you know, the US or anyone could focus their attentions on. It sounds like Russia's, you know, focusing intently on AI and autonomy. You know, what are the implications if the US does not attempt to achieve dominance also in that category? And then, you know, the next question is, should the US attempt to compete and achieve dominance there, or should the US also try to focus on asymmetric advantage in a different area?
So the main reason why everyone, or at least Russia in this sense, is looking into AI is that it's a crucial decision-making tool. So it is a crucial emerging technology that provides it the ability to not only speed up its decision-making process, but also be able to act before an enemy can act and have leverage over the situation. So that goes with Russia's reflexive control, trying to make sure that they take actions that are able to influence their adversaries to take an action that's favorable to Russia. So that kind of goes with the AI and autonomy, and why they're looking for that, to give them that more information, more accurate information, and faster information, to have a better situational awareness, and also to be able to act and do what they need to do against the US and the West as their adversaries. So for your question on the, what was your question again? Sorry.
So I was asking, okay, it seems clear from the research you've done that that is a primary focus of Russia. You even had a quote from Putin where he believes that whoever achieves AI dominance is going to rule the world. And
yes.
you know, so okay, I would love it if the US ruled the world. I would not love it if Russia ruled the world. But my question to you is, do you believe that's true? Do you believe that AI, whoever achieves dominance in AI, will genuinely, you know, be the preeminent power in the world? And should the US also try to focus on, you know, dominance in that area, in addition to, you know, dealing with things like hypersonic threats and, you know, incredibly large armies in countries like China, you know, all the areas that we have to focus on and compete in? Do you feel like AI bubbles up, and autonomy bubbles up near to the top?
I would say it does. The reason why is that you're working at machine speed, and human speed is no match for a machine speed. I would say that when you're looking at artificial intelligence and autonomy, you have to notice that when you have these capabilities, you can't just put that against human speed or human operators. These capabilities provide that rapid decision making. And because, and you would see in a lot of these articles and a lot of documents that talk about the change in the character of war. Right now, we're very much changing that character of war, especially when we're talking about artificial intelligence and autonomy. Now, it's not about how big your military is or how much military equipment you have. It's about how fast you can act and how fast you can make decisions. Because those big military and big armies, they take a lot of time, they take a lot of effort, but when you can act fast and you have that connectivity, you have that rapid speed and rapid movement that autonomy and artificial intelligence allows, then that is what gives you that information advantage and information superiority over the enemy. So I would say that is a big part of why we as the US should start on this today, or we should be getting on these developments with artificial intelligence and autonomy. And it's not a quick and easy fix. So that's why today is the right day to do it, or even yesterday was the right day to do it, because right now you have to build that intellectual base, you have to build that physical infrastructure for AI and autonomy. It's very intellectual heavy, and you need a lot of experience for that as well. And you also have to, it's not only about transforming, say, your military systems and putting those types of technologies onto them, but also transforming the culture. We're not accustomed to using AI or autonomy, and that may change how we fight the enemy, that may change how we do business. And that's what we need to not only start those foundational infrastructure developments, but also start that process of changing that culture and changing our processes and tactics, techniques, and procedures in order to make sure that we can effectively use artificial intelligence and AI, whether it be in space or whether it be across all of our domains in the future.
Got it. So we have a question from the audience from Nick. Nick says that out of a lack of government funding, we're becoming very dependent on private companies like SpaceX. What are the vulnerabilities there, especially with their work in AI, including Tesla?
So I would say that has actually been our strength as the US in looking to private companies and private sector investments with artificial intelligence and autonomy. And that's what has kind of brought us ahead of our competitors, especially with Russia. That's kind of what they are not doing. They're doing it with government funding, and they're using state-controlled companies to bring about their artificial intelligence and AI development. So I would say that it can be a vulnerability. I think we need to make sure that we work together with the private sector. But I also think that you are correct that it is, we need to start as a military or as a government and within ourselves to bring about some of these changes and start working at it independently, but also in some places mesh them with the private sector to get more of that competitive environment and to get more of that expertise and more of that talent to help in the government side of AI and autonomy development.
Thank you. There's one more question from JTF-SD, maybe someone with the initials JTF from San Diego. This individual asks, do you feel the pursuit of norms for AI or space is in our national interest? Why or why not?
I would say yes, especially when we're talking about an AI race or an AI or autonomy race with Russia and China. A lot of things that we have done has been the norm of what is expected for everyone else, whether it be in space, whether it be in UAVs, you can, however you want to say it. And if we look at how Russia is developing their AI and autonomy systems or their infrastructure, you can see that they're very much emulating what the US is doing. They put up the Russia Foundation of Advanced Research Projects, their agency, their military research agency in 2012. And that is very analogous to the DARPA, which is our military research agency. So they're seeing what we're doing and trying to bring about change within that. That kind of goes with the norms. If we are the ones that are trying to take the human out of the loop for AI or autonomy and try to put it on some satellites or on an ASAT or in a UAV, they're going to see that and they're going to say, hey, the US is doing that. We can do that too. So I think trying to stay within our norms and our liberal values, and also making sure that we stay within the international human law for distinction, proportionality, and that accountability to make sure we have the human in the decision loop and make sure we have human making decisions that are detrimental, that could be detrimental to not only our national security, but someone else's and even in the world. I think that is very important that we need to stick to that. I think there are ways for us to have discussions, not only with our partners and our allies to try to leverage that and bring about those values that we want to have and norms, but also have discussions with Russia and China and trying to get a cooperation going or some kind of guidance or guidelines that we can all agree on in order to make sure that we don't have risk of escalation or a crisis instability when something happens as it pertains to artificial intelligence and autonomy.
Thank you. So JTF is Joint Task Force Space Defense at Schriever. So local to myself, I'm in Colorado Springs. One more question from Nick. Are there potential threats with cooperating nations on something like the ISS? Nick says that he knows that the technology there is fairly dated. Could there be vulnerabilities into US systems or data from that aspect?
So I would say yes. I think any legacy system would have vulnerabilities as it pertains to if we were to use, say, AI or autonomy against these systems. I don't have too much knowledge of the ISS in their actual like sensors or anything of that nature in their software, but I'm pretty sure that any legacy system would have some type of vulnerability when it comes to the use of emerging technologies against them.
Okay, if there's any more questions, please put them in the chat. We'll keep doing that. I have a few questions and comments on both topics now. Thank you both, Captain Lee and Ms. Dominguez, for giving us that overview and fielding those questions. Briefly, I just want to touch on something Captain Lee spoke about earlier, and that was the standards for cybersecurity from everything, including the supply chain, being necessary to secure the future of the US space mission architecture and really just all products within the entire DoD lifecycle. There is a new standard coming out. It's not enforced yet, and who knows what will happen in the next year or two as it starts to roll out, but it's called the Cyber Maturity Models Certification, the CMMC. And there are different scales or different ratings within the CMMC. I think it's level 1 to 5. And so depending on what your cybersecurity practices are, what protocols you implement, what hardware you use, things like that, this is supposed to be the de facto standard across the board for all people who are doing business with the DoD, so that there is fair and equal and well understood treatment across the board for the private sector who want to build things and participate in the supply chain for the DoD. Question for Captain Lee is, do you feel like something like that is a good start? Do you think that we could do better? And do you hope to see that actually get implemented here in the next, I think it's year to 2 years is when it's going to be allegedly required?
Yeah, I absolutely think that's a good start. And I do, hope to see it get rolled out and implemented. And I think as the standards are implemented, hopefully we will be able to see like where in that like model we can improve or like, raise standards to ensure that, our partners, are adhering to the highest possible cybersecurity standards, since it does involve our national security. But I do think the CMMC is an awesome place to start.
Great. And then final question for Ms. Dominguez from myself is, in your paper, you discuss how Russia's government is still really more like a dictatorship in a lot of different ways. It's not communism anymore. It's not the USSR, but yet you compare things like Russia to China, which really is a true communist state, and China seems to have a little bit more agility in advancing their own technologies, either on weapons platforms or electronic warfare, things like that. Why is it that that state is having, maybe you could say, a little more success in advancing their technological capabilities matching their capabilities to their ambitions than perhaps Russia is. Is it really just economics? Is it just the government structure? Corruption is even greater at Russia than it is in China. You know, how do you see those things playing a factor in that?
Okay, so China would call themselves like the socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's what they call their state. But what they did was open up to foreign direct investment or foreign investment. And that's what Russia still hasn't done really. They also have really helped startups and even believe in them more so and provide them assistance. And that is not a thing really in Russia. It's hard to become a startup and to have that support from the government within Russia. And also with that top-down approach that Russia has, everything is very centralized and controlled, and a lot of the resources are misappropriated due to that, all that corruption. China, on the other hand, is looking for more economic growth through ventures and overseas investments and things of that nature. Most of the time, really, what they want is you to rapidly grow and rapidly become successful. As long as you toe the party line of the Chinese Communist Party, then you're good to go. But in Russia's sense, they very much want control over those companies. And if there's not a lot of competition and not a lot of investment going on, they also don't have a lot of customer demand or domestic demand within their country. Their population is rapidly or gradually, really progressively decreasing compared to China. They have so much customer demand. They have not only a big population, but it continues to grow. And that population is using all kinds of advanced technology and emerging technology. So they do have that market, whereas Russia doesn't. And then Russia also has to compete with China and the US for that market, and it's already behind in that sense. Russia also has not developed its foundational expertise as for AI and autonomy. And China started that early, back in the 90s and back in the early 2000s. They looked at, okay, we need to put more money into foundational research, foundational development of AI and autonomy, and Russia did not do that. So right now they're behind because of that. And so that's where you see the difference within China and Russia. China was able to open up, get that more investment, believes in their startups, has that customer demand or that domestic demand, whereas Russia doesn't. And they're also very much misappropriating their resources. The resource curse is very evident within Russia, to where they're misappropriating those natural resources they have, like oil and gas, and using those for Putin's ruling elite and not for the actual economy. And that is what's really hurting also the Russian government and Russia development and innovation. So they have really smart people from the STEM community, of the science, technical, engineering, and math community, but a lot of times they don't even stay, or they leave and go to either China or the US to get their expertise and sometimes even stay there. So they have a hard time also keeping that talent as well.
Interesting. Okay, Captain Lee, do you have any questions or comments for Ms. Dominguez?
Yeah, and this is more specific to the paper, but I know in your paper you discussed that Russia's got kind of four main focus areas for their robotic systems. And you also talked about how breakthroughs in their military AI can probably be expected first in their ISR assets and stuff. But for their focus areas like the unmanned aerial vehicles, ground-based robotic systems, underwater AVs, and unmanned boats, is there one that you see being a priority as providing a more viable advantage than the others?
I wouldn't say maybe a priority, but I would say at least Russia has seen it as a priority. So we see them very much focused on unmanned vehicles, or unmanned aerial vehicles to be exact, but also ground vehicles as well. And that is really those are easier fixes, or easier to incorporate artificial intelligence and autonomy functions. And that's kind of where they're going towards and what they're prioritizing in the near term. These are also those that they can see more immediate effects to the battlefield. And that's really what they want to see. In order to keep growing that capability, they want to see what progress this is making, say in operations in Syria or in operations in Ukraine, things of that nature. So you can see that Russia is prioritizing those two aspects, the unmanned aerial vehicles as well as ground combat vehicles. And that is why some of my paper talks about how putting those systems or emerging technologies, AI and autonomy within the space architecture is going to be a lot further down the line in the long term, because they are focusing on these other systems that bring more immediate progress and immediate results for their operations.
Any other questions, Captain Lee, or likewise, Ms. Dominguez, any questions for Captain Lee?
I think Nick put up a question. Do you see space technology becoming more modular for ease and speed of updating systems, and even cost savings, or is that my dream? I would hope so. I think I can see that, but I also see that that is very difficult for not only Russia, but for the US as well. Making it more like speeding up and upgrading these systems takes a lot of time, takes a lot of money, especially when we already, like you said, Dr. Stein, that we already have legacy systems up there that are already doing the mission, and then we're kind of relying on that. So it will be hard for us to try to change that dynamic and that culture of that modular sense of those advanced systems.
So along those lines, having worked in industry before I was at the MITRE Corporation, you see a lot of momentum in things like the small sat industry, but it's not just small sats. There's a lot of momentum to get standards codified and put into place so that you can build something as simple as just a printed circuit board that has a particular bus interface to the rest of, the bus is usually referred to the vehicle itself. But the objective is to be able to get people in industry to develop specific sized cards, whether 10-inch cards or 20-centimeter cards, whatever the size is. The objective is to have specific pinouts on the card, so the card can just plug into what we call the bus. And then the vendor, the contractor can put in their own unit on a satellite. But then it also works for ground units as well. So at a ground station where all the satellites eventually have to talk to one way or another, it's all going to come from space to ground, and likewise from ground to space. Within the ground architecture, there's a lot of push in industry to make these things common. Typically the only standard that people had to work with was the size of the unit in the rack, the network rack, and everything else was anybody's guess. It was kind of the Wild West, and eventually cable standards became more common, and now we're getting down to the point where we're looking at cards, specific cards that you can put onto a satellite, so that we can make things, as you said, more modular. Has it occurred? No, we're still in the pipe dream, but we're maybe most of the way down the pipe. Like you can actually see the sunlight at the end of the pipe, if you will. It is coming. It's very hard to get a free society completely on board with a single standard. And you can look at things like IEEE and other groups, standard setting groups like that, that try to do things like, hey, what Wi-Fi standard should we use next? 802.11, whatever, Y, Z, whatever's coming up. Those are really hard things to get people to do. It can sometimes be even more contentious within the DoD life cycle, because you have a smaller but very vocal group of people who are building very exquisite systems. These are not going to be broadly commercially used, and these vendors are competing very fiercely for the opportunity to get their stuff on board a system. And then there's just so many difficult requirements that can be set by the DoD, to achieve that exquisite performance level, that sometimes these standards getting a standard in place is sometimes next to impossible. It's not impossible. A lot of progress has been made. The objective is, again, to drive down that cost. But probably, honestly, probably one of the best things that's happened is companies like SpaceX coming out and saying, look, we're here, we're going to launch this rocket, we're going to call it the Falcon 9. And if you want a place on this rocket, this is how much it costs $5 million a spot or something like that. If you want to get on this rocket, you better build your thing like this. And that's it, period. We will not carry anybody else's stuff. Unless you want to buy the whole rocket, and now you're back to $50 million launches. And so companies like that have actually really helped the DoD, because they're like, look, I don't want to spend $50 million to launch my satellite. I want to spend $5 million as a ride share. And so now I have to conform to specific electronic standards or power standards or things like that. So companies like SpaceX are really helping. Honestly, really helping the DoD by being the forcing function. Nick made a comment about the 15-pin connectors versus USB-C. Yeah, yeah. So even down to Apple, you're right. So sometimes a company's just going to come out and be like, look, this is the standard. We're going to use the Lightning connector. Period. I don't care if the world is using USB-C, and then all of a sudden a whole ecosystem shows up around Lightning connectors. So companies like SpaceX do play to our advantage, in my opinion, rather than an authoritative, body saying, you will all use the 20-pin connector, and that's it. Okay, so we are at the top of our hour. I want to thank our speakers, our authors, Ms. Dominguez, Captain Lee. Thank you for taking the time to share your research with us. I thoroughly enjoyed reading your papers. And again, these are just such good synopses on Russian capabilities in areas that I feel are critical to national interest, and all at the unclassed level, which is a delight, because now you can share it with your friends and the rest of the world, and get people on board with the things that America needs to be paying attention to. And I love that this is the research that is occurring at and happening in the advanced research arm within the Air Force, because this is what the future leaders and the current leaders of America are focusing on, which is what they should be focusing on, in my opinion, in my strong opinion. So thank you for what you've done. Thank you for sharing your research. And I will leave it there. If there's any more questions or comments, please leave them in the chat. Thank you, Nick, for your comments. And be delighted to talk more. Anything else you want to say, Ms. Dominguez, Captain Lee? If not, I'm signing off here.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.